and plants have had millions of years to evolve defenses. And so we just take advantage of what plants have been doing for millions of years.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Dave, who's painfully shy and doesn't like his personal information shared. He's a pharmacologist and a biomedical scientist, and he's going to talk with us today about drugs. Thanks for joining us today, Dave.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited to talk with you about drugs. My understanding is that you have a background where you studied in pharmacology and also biomedical science, and that you really think of yourself as a scientist. Why do you love being a scientist?
Oh, I just like the way it frames the way you look at the world and how you start feeling comfortable with not knowing things.
So basically, being a scientist means to be comfortable not knowing things?
Yeah, because that drives the questions that will allow you to start exploring truths, learning new truths. If you don't know something and you're curious about it, it'll drive the question that will help you search for the truth. And that's the fun of the science.
I see. So it's really more like a process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all in the question you're trying to answer.
Can you give me an example of that?
Oh, well, an example, you see lightning in the sky and you wonder what that is. And you start trying to figure out what lightning is, how it happens, what's that sound, why does the sound happen? And you start trying to think about what are the ways you could discover lightning. Now, in the realm of drugs, it would be, somebody eats a leaf and doesn't feel their tongue, and you want to figure out what's the thing in that leaf that makes people's tongue go numb, and then what is the process that's in the tongue that makes you feel in the first place, and what's the interaction in the physiology between that leaf and that numbness, and that's where pharmacology comes in.
I see. So is pharmacology, just as a field, is it about making drugs?
No, it's not about making drugs, although that's an aspect of it. It's more about understanding when you take something into your body that's foreign, what happens to it? What does it do to your body? How does it distribute within your body? How do you eliminate it out of your body? And in the case of pharmacology, it actually goes into the realm of also xenobiotics, which is just anything that's going into your body. It touches upon food as well, but mostly it's about chemicals, how they get into your body, what they do once they're in your body, and how do you get rid of them out of your body.
Okay, so comparing pharmacology with biomedical science, because that's what you got your PhD in, how would you explain to somebody what biomedical science is?
It's just a rebranding of pharmacology. So pharmacology is a fairly old field. It started really, modern pharmacology started in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, and really caught wind in the 20th century with many discoveries and better understanding of physiology and the interactions. But late in the 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of colleges decided they needed to rebrand their programs to make them more exciting to grad students. So they changed the name of physiology and pharmacology into things like biomedical sciences or molecular pharmacology, and they just tried to jazz up the name. But essentially, it's the same department.
So is it the study of drugs on the body as well, or substances on the body?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a broad field. The beautiful thing I like about pharmacology is it's interdisciplinary. It integrates physiology and organic chemistry and medicinal chemistry and neuroscience. And so it's kind of a beautiful harmonization of those disciplines make up pharmacology. And although you can dive down deep into any one of those particular things, you can still it still falls under the rubric of pharmacology. So you could study how muscles work, and it could be an aspect of pharmacology. But most pharmacology involves something to do with a medicine, either using it as a tool to discover how a system works in physiology. So it's very common. Many ideas in physiology gained traction once a chemical was used as a tool to perturb the system. And then you start learning more about the system once you've perturbed it. An example would be, and you'll see actually in the naming of the physiological receptor from a pharmacological compound. So there's a receptor that's in all your organs called the nicotinic receptor. And that is obviously named from the drug nicotine. And the whole physiology of those receptors, which are on your organs, comes from using nicotine as a tool to understand the physiology. And that's a lot of what pharmacology does. The muscarinic receptor comes from the drug muscarine, which is from the mushroom Amanita muscaria. And it also is involved in the physiology of your body, but it's pharmacologically defined. And so those drugs were used as tool compounds to understand the underlying physiology.
So this all feels and sounds really super nerdy.
It is, yeah.
Okay. And like it involves a lot of math or something. So what drove you into these fields? And, what does a person typically do after studying this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what drove me into the field was kind of luck. In my particular case, I happened to go to an undergraduate school that actually offered pharmacology as a degree program, which is very rare. There's only a few in the country in the United States that offer it as a degree program. And I went into school not knowing what I was going to do. And I had a family friend who was going to med school and invited me to a pharmacology colloquium. And I went and I was kind of hooked after that. In fact, I hadn't even taken biology 1. I was taking pharmacology classes. So the thing that was just so attractive to me, well, first, the idea that you could help people, that you're actually trying to help people and do some interesting science all at the same time so you can love your job and also help people, to me, it felt bigger than me, and it felt like I could do good in the world and still enjoy my job. That was kind of one of the draws. And then once you get into it, you realize how much there is to know of different disciplines. And that to me was very attractive, to try and understand all these different disciplines and how they work together to understand what happens to a drug when you take it in your body and all the things it does and where it goes.
I mean, I totally get this idea, like the practical, like I could like this, but was there something specific? You said helping people, right? But was there something even deeper than that that came up for you when you decided to study this?
Well, I mean, yes, my father had passed away when I was young, and it definitely drove me into the idea of going into medicine to see if I could help people, that they wouldn't have to go through the same kind of pain I went through as a teenager, losing my father so young. And that was an impetus for me to explore pharmacology as well. And, I did get lucky. I feel like I got lucky.
And so thank you for sharing that with the audience. Did you then start practicing as a pharmacologist? Like, what does a pharmacologist do? Do you go work in a pharmacy?
So a common trajectory for a pharmacologist is to work in the drug industry. So most drugs that get approved have a huge amount of research that goes into the development of a medicine. And pharmacology can interact in kind of multiple aspects of the developing of a drug. Mostly, how does it distribute? So a pharmacologist, if you have an idea of a disease target that you want to explore to drug, you have to figure out, what is it doing to your digestion? What is it doing to your, is it coming out of your lungs? Does it interact with other medications? So a pharmacologist has to figure out all the different things about what's happening to that drug when it's taken in. Now, there's different models that are used in animals to try and mimic what happens in a human being, and a pharmacologist is involved in that. And it can have to do with, does it interfere with intestinal motility? So are you going to get constipated if you take this drug? A pharmacologist will help figure that out. Will it interact with your cholesterol-lowering drugs? A pharmacologist will help figure that out. How does it work in the first place? A pharmacologist can help figure that out. So pharmacologists commonly do go into the biotech and drug industry, pharmaceutical industry. That's the most common place for a pharmacologist to go.
Okay, so does a pharmacologist then have to understand chemistry and then also, I guess, the function of a drug in a body? So, like how the body is supposed to operate, and then also the function of a drug on the body. Is that sort of a easy way of summarizing it?
A pharmacologist will try and figure out, will learn about what it does. So they'll develop that knowledge and then they'll explain it to other people. But one of the job of a pharmacologist is to figure out how it's working. That's part of the job of a pharmacologist.
I see. So, what makes something a drug?
Well, that's a good question. A drug is essentially, well, these days, the meaning of a drug is far flung these days, but a traditional drug before biotech is a small organic molecule, typically small, that essentially a targeted poison to some system in the body that will modulate its activity and give you an outcome that you want, whether it's lower cholesterol or killing a fungus that's on your toe or something like that. So a drug essentially is a selective poison. And of course, the pharmacologists for years and years have essentially been scouring nature because nature essentially is the biggest bounty for chemical warfare because, a plant doesn't want to be eaten by an insect, so it develops chemical arsenal to make the insect give it indigestion or whatever. And so pharmacologists traditionally have gone into the forests and into the environment to try and understand what are the poisons that nature has come up with, because nature, it's shocking how much variety there is in nature and how powerful it is. And have gotten most of their armamentarium from nature and slight derivatives from it. Most drugs come from plants, and plants have had millions of years to evolve defenses. And so we just take advantage of what plants have been doing for millions of years.
But I'm trying to understand because we use plants, well, we use drugs for, I assume, in modern medicine that drugs are being used for healing. So when I hear you say that a drug is a selective poison or a targeted poison, that doesn't quite make sense to me. Why do you think that is? That it's not really matching up with my understanding of what healing is.
It's mostly because the term poison connotes a bad thing to have in your body. But the reason I use it in a technical way, because essentially the drug is doing something to gum up the works of something that's either overactive in your body's overreacting. And a good example of that would be, let's say, an allergy medicine where your histamine, you've got too much histamine being produced and it's making you miserable. And so you give a selective poison to counteract the histamine's effect so it makes you feel better. That would be an example of your body overreacting or reacting to such a degree that it makes you uncomfortable. Of course, that's a symptomatic drug. There are drugs that deal with hepatitis C and other types of things that will poison a bacteria, which is a bad thing, or poison a virus, which is another bad thing. But many times, if you're poisoning your own systems, it's because they're hyperactive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's really different from the way I was taught about herbal medicine. And I'm sure that a lot of people listening will probably have a reaction to it. But I guess it's sort of, I mean, it sounds a little bit like the drugs are trying to interfere with a process that has gone haywire for some reason. And so that's why there's this sort of, I guess, maybe what I'm perceiving as like a negative interference, but it's like negatively interfering on something that's already going negative. Is that kind of the idea?
That's exactly right. Yep. It's inhibiting a bad thing.
If you want to create a more receptive body, free from toxins, inflammation, and metabolic issues, would it be crazy for you to explore booking an Ayurvedic consultation with me? There's probably never been a more perfect time to do it. Every day you wait matters when it comes to your health. So if you're ready to get your body back in balance, I'll give you a 30-day plan to get you started. Go to heathergrish.com to book a consultation. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. I see. Okay. So I think, in terms of drugs, like you were talking about, and I know that it sounds like one of your mentors in the beginning was early pioneer in the field who came from Scotland and who spent time in the Amazon with indigenous people. And you mentioned that sort of like traditionally people were collecting plant samples. And, I know in Ayurvedic medicine, We always hear the story about this medicine, shilajit, which, grows, it like oozes from the rocks in India. And they would notice that the monkeys, after licking this particular substance off the rocks, would go and like have lots of sex. And that sort of became a clue that they could use this drug for, male erectile dysfunction and things like that. So, I mean, obviously, like learning from nature is a thing, but then sort of moving into this now, this ability that people can synthesize drugs and make drugs. So, how are drugs made actually these days?
Well, that's a good question. So it's complicated. In fact, many drugs are still use plants as an intermediate. So I'll give you an example. There's a cancer drug called Taxol that was discovered in the bark of the Pacific yew tree, and it's used for breast cancer, and it inhibits a structural element of the cell called the microtubule, and so essentially it gums up the work so DNA can't split into daughter cells, so it gums up mitosis, which cancer is doing all the time, splitting in half, and it gums it up. And this drug was discovered in the bark of Pacific yew, but these trees are hundreds of years old, so they laid out a purely synthetic route for this compound, so they were able to synthesize it from scratch in a lab. But that turned out to be very expensive and very laborious, and the yields were very low. So what they decided to do is essentially farm little saplings of the Pacific yew tree. So they would grow the Pacific yew tree for a couple years, and in the bark, it wouldn't be perfect Taxol, but it'd be close enough so they could take the bark and then just do some slight modifications to it, and then get the same chemical compound in the end. So some medicines are actually still use plants as an intermediate. Most medicines are completely synthesized on a large scale, and that is a complicated process because you have to, not only does the medicine, you have this active ingredient, it's called the pharmaceutical active ingredient, it has to be able to be shipped to somebody, it has to have a shelf life so that they know when they're taking this medicine, it is what they're taking. So tests have to be done with the fillers that go in the pills to see which one is going to stabilize the chemical compound the most, so it improves the shelf life the best, so you know that what you're taking is really what it says it is. But essentially what happens is they'll come up with a compound, and then they'll try and figure out the best way to scale it up. And there's chemical engineers that their whole job is just to figure out how to make this stuff by the ton. And it is a very different process. And they sometimes will actually select from different compounds the ones that are the most amenable to being synthesized. And it's actually been a strike against the pharmaceutical industry that sometimes, every problem that a chemical engineer sees is a nail and they're the hammer and that's all they can do. So it can limit their mental scope and what's the chemicals that could be brought forth, but are just a little bit more challenging. So there's definitely biases that happen in the industry where people tend to want to do kind of the more straightforward, simpler things and get away from the more complicated things. That being said, there are some separate whole fields that are extremely complicated, but then, of course, when you have very complicated processes, that adds a lot of expense. So if you take a drug that's an antibody drug, like a biotech drug, those things are so much more expensive than just taking a pill, because a nurse has to give you the drug, and it's just everything about it is more expensive and more costly. But sometimes that's the only way to go. So drugs run the gambit from a small, simple chemical that's dirt cheap to make, like aspirin, to things that involve plant intermediates, and all the way to purely chemically synthesized in large vats. So it runs the gambit.
So being from the more natural healing world myself, and possibly some of the listeners, there's a belief, I would say, in the circles that I'm in, that there is somehow a difference between a drug that is naturally derived, meaning grown by nature in the dirt or, harvested from nature, versus a drug that is synthetically derived. What's your take on that from maybe like a chemical and atomic level? I mean, so what's your take on that?
If the chemical, like aspirin, from the structure of aspirin has a certain amount of carbons and they're connected in a particular way, and if you can show that you've made the same exact structure that nature has made, there's no difference by the laws of physics, kind of, that would be detectable. There are some differences that happen between a natural compound and a non-natural. I mean, some things would be like the amount of natural radiation could be different depending on this, where it was grown and things like that, how much radioactive nitrogen or radioactive carbon is in the drug, if it was a plant that's been growing in a bad place compared to something that, it just depends. Those would be very, very, very subtle difference and have virtually no effect on the body, because all of the effect of a drug in the body has to do with the electrons and not the nucleus. So if the chemical structures are the same, they're identical and it doesn't matter where they come from. The difference between herbology and herbs, of course, is they're not distilled. They're usually taken as the plant itself or some extract where it's complicated with many, many other things, and the actual dose is much less than you'd potentially get in a synthesized compound, which doesn't have in pharmacology, we call them impurities, because the way a pharmacologist would figure out how a drug works is you would take, let's say, the plant that you're chewing on or whatever, and we would grind it up and mix it in, for example, you mix it in a separation funnel where you have, let's say, olive oil on one part of the separation funnel and water on the other part of the separation funnel. You mix it up, you take that extract, the part that got in the oil, and you drop it on the frog muscle and you see if it twitches. And if it doesn't twitch, then you put the water fraction on and see if it twitches. And then if that one twitches, then you take the water one and you separate that further, and you keep on separating it until you find the single compound that caused that frog muscle to twitch. That's the compound that a pharmacologist would say is the active ingredient. And then we could manufacture that on a large scale, versus the herb, we've got all those other things that end up in the oil, and they didn't twitch the muscle. They may be doing something to other parts of the body, but we don't know what that is because it's really complicated. So it's really trying to simplify the medicine and trying to understand at a more simple level what's happening. Even distilling it out down to the chemical essence of what's causing that muscle to twitch, it's still complicated, even that single one. When you take a plant and you have all of the other compounds in there, it's actually mind-bogglingly complicated, and it may not make the muscle twitch as well. So that's the big difference.
It definitely sounds mind-bogglingly complicated, and I know that you have often been a person in your family who, as you know, most people as they get older start getting on multiple pharmaceuticals, and that increases as they get older and older, and how that becomes a challenge to manage, not just for the individual, but also by the physicians that are supporting. And oftentimes you've had to intervene on behalf of someone in your family to discuss with a doctor, because there's so much going on chemically with all these drugs that people are taking that it's actually even kind of hard for the doctors to follow, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that is true. Most doctors wouldn't be trained to see the kinds of things I would be trained to see. And they end up prescribing or over prescribing many drugs, and people can be on many, many, many drugs. And I have had the instance where I've had to look at a list of drugs and understand the interactions of those drugs. And what can happen with people on chronic medication is that through time, your ability to metabolize that medication can be lessened. And in the balance, when part of the dosing of a medicine is to try and keep a particular therapeutic window accessible to the target. And what happens is that therapeutic window is regulated by the balance of how fast you're getting rid of the drug out of your body, by the liver and by your urine, or how it's getting out of your body, plus what's coming into your body. So it's that balance that tells you what's the bioavailability of that drug. Well, if one of those things changes, like in terms of the ability to eliminate, then all of a sudden you may have a higher dose in your body because you're not getting rid of it as fast. And this, of course, can happen as you age. Your ability to get rid of a drug is lessened, which could increase the chances for cross-talk between medications, especially if you're on 9 medications. And I've had the instance where I've had to catch these things where it's causing severe symptoms, essentially of a poisoning, a bad poisoning, with bad side effects because the metabolism is slowing down. And these are people who are on these drugs for 20, 30 years. They start out at 50. By the time they're 80, they're not metabolizing them at the same rate. And so the doctors are not on top of the adjustments and how fast you'd have to adjust and measure that. It's just not done. So the patient would present, in this case, I had somebody who was presenting as if they were having strokes and they were being treated as if they were having stroke. All that really had to be done is they had to be taken off of a medication and that cured them. So yeah, it can have dire consequences if not caught.
So you're not a person that likes to use a lot of drugs. I mean, you've never even smoked marijuana.
I'm a pharmacologist. I don't take drugs if I don't need to.
So, which is interesting because there are some people, as I've noticed in my practice, there are some people who really like to take things and they'll take tons of supplements, and they may also be on various medications for different medical conditions. And obviously, no one likes to be sick. I understand that. But there does seem to be sort of a group of people who are more comfortable taking things, even supplements and such, and a group of people who are sort of not a fan of taking things. What do you think the difference is there? What makes a person want to take things versus not want to take things?
It's actually kind of ironic because the earliest pharmacologists used to take things on their, test things by themselves and then try and write down what they were feeling. So I was taught by some early pharmacologists, but I don't follow in their footsteps as well as I should. In the end, it's two things. One is I happen to have a constitution where I'm willing to suck up some pain so I don't have to take drugs. So that's one aspect. And I also don't like having my thoughts being distorted by drugs. I'm open to trying some things, but definitely not habitually. In the end, it's people's ability, willing to take risks, how open people are to risky behavior. I mean, you can follow to any type of risky behavior, bungee jumping or anything like that. To me, it's a risky behavior, and I try to keep the arena of where I take risks to things out in nature and fun. I choose not to take risks in that. And partly because I like to do active things, and many drugs are ingested by smoke. And I had asthma growing up, and I just kind of grew up not wanting to be around smoke. And for some reason, I associated a lot of drugs with smoke.
You mentioned that you didn't want to have your thoughts distorted. Can you talk a little bit about how a pharmacological agent or a drug could distort thoughts?
Well, the classic things are what would be called line labeling distortions. So what that means is that if I yell into your eye really doesn't perceive it. It's not designed to perceive sound. It's designed to perceive light. And if I shine a light in your ear, you don't see anything because your ear is designed, it's a sensory organ designed only for hearing. The same if I shine a light in your nose, it's only designed for smelling. So what line labeling does is it kind of, and there are medicines that are psychedelics that do this, where you could hear a sound and then have it affect your vision. So, all of a sudden the walls start talking to you, or some distortion is happening in your sensory perception because of other sensory perceptions crossing over. And to me, I liked keeping my sensory perceptions, well straight in front of me and not be distorted by line labeling mix-ups.
Yeah. So in terms of, I know you know a little bit about Ayurveda, and I know you know a little bit about herbal medicines, but I guess maybe starting with Ayurveda, which is obviously broader than herbal medicines. What's your take on Ayurveda? What's your take on it, and what parts of it do you see it benefiting people?
Well, I think it has a role in many of the gap areas, I'd say, of traditional pharmacology, and where a lot of traditional pharmaceutical companies are leaving, and that is in things like depression, a lot of mental illness. I think people that come to Ayurveda could benefit, and I think there's even studies that have shown that there can be benefit on depression and things like that. Where the problem in traditional pharmaceuticals is that there's so little known about the brain that we know how to mess it up. You take a mushroom or something like that, but we don't know how to necessarily fix schizophrenia very well or fix depression very well. And so there's a huge exodus out of those fields by traditional pharmaceutical companies. And I think there's definitely a role in Ayurveda for things that affect mood and disposition for the people that come to it.
Is there anything that you have heard about Ayurveda, that what you've learned about it so far, that doesn't seem to line up with your understanding of biomedical science?
Oh, well, I mean, the idea of learning things from the intensity of the pulse unless you're talking about heart disease or something like that. There's some notions about channels and things like that that don't line up with typical physiological perspectives of the body. The idea that there's humors and things like that, that doesn't line up with modern pharmacology. So there's a bunch of aspects, and obviously the herbs themselves, although I'm sure, guaranteed, there are active pharmaceutical ingredients in all of the herbs that are prescribed in Ayurveda, because they're so complicated and the doses, the actual amounts are not known in the herbs. A pharmacologist would want to find out what was working inside of those herbs. And that has happened in Chinese medicine. There was a Nobel Prize won for this exact thing, for figuring out the active ingredient in the Chinese herbal medicine and making that available as an anti-malarial, I believe. So yeah, I think what would be very interesting is to look at traditional Ayurveda herbs and try and figure out, kind of meld that with pharmacology and see what is the stuff a pharmacologist would find valuable that they wouldn't have found any other way.
So, okay, I know that you're a very private person, but I'm guessing there are a couple of people that are going to find this conversation pretty interesting. And I just want to give you the opportunity to, would you like people to contact you to ask questions? Or if anybody has questions, that they reach out to me and then I get in touch with you?
Yeah, that would be the best. If somebody has a question, I'd be happy to answer it. They just ask you, and I'd be absolutely delighted to answer any questions they put to you.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you being here with me today. And thank you so much for being on the Wisdom of the Body.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on the Wisdom of the Body.